Hello and welcome to a special edition of Inside Syria. I'm James Bays at the United Nations European headquarters in Geneva, where Syrian peace talks have finally got underway. After almost 3 years of brutal fighting, 2 Syrian delegations, one from the government, one from the opposition, have sat around the same U-shaped table in the building behind me. However, they're not talking directly to each other and they haven't agreed on a single point. In a moment, with our panel, we'll be discussing the huge gap between the two sides and the prospects for peace. First, though, a look at the current state of the talks. Here's Zaina Hodder.
Undoubtedly a milestone in the Syrian conflict, but this is just the beginning. Both sides over the past few days have been blaming each other for the violence, calling each other terrorists, trying to discredit each other. Clearly, they don't see each other as partners in a peace process, but the international community has been so determined to get this conference, this political process underway. Now, both sides came with conflicting agendas. Yes, they both expressed their commitment to the Geneva I communique, which calls for the setting up of a transitional body with full executive powers, but they have different understandings. For the Syrian government, the priority is to fight terrorism. They believe once they fight terrorism and end the violence, then there will be stability, and then they can talk about the new authorities in the country. But for the opposition, they want a transitional body formed as soon as possible, and they also want Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to leave power. So there is a gap. But undoubtedly, the process has begun. What we understand is at least the two sides could agree on opening humanitarian corridors. They need to alleviate the plight of the Syrian people. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon himself said, in the interim, while the discussions are going on, we cannot forget about the Syrian people. But this is not just about Syria. This is about the region. There are regional and international players who have influence in Syria, and they will be doing the negotiations as well.
Well, let's discuss all of this now with our panel of guests joining us here in Geneva. We have with us Rafif Joejati, who is one of the spokespersons for the opposition. Also here is Dr. Yazan Abdallah. He's a Syrian academic who's here monitoring the talks in Geneva. And also with us is Ian Black, who's the Middle East editor of The Guardian. And I'd like to start with you, Ian, and I'm going to ask all our guests this question. What do you think are the chances of success?
Well, I'll stick my neck out early in the day. I think that now that the talks have finally begun, everybody knows that it's taken a long time to get to this point, I think that the pressure on the parties to stay in the talks will probably tip the balance towards an eventual positive outcome. How long that will take and what comes out at the end of it is, of course, another question. But I think that now that the process is on the way, chances must have improved.
Rafif, when I spoke in a press conference in the last few hours to Dr. Brahimi, who's chairing all this, he said, I'm worried all the time, this isn't going to be easy. Do you think there's a chance of success here?
Absolutely. I would agree with what Ian said, but I would also add to that the fact that from an opposition perspective, we've already seen some success. Today, we told the dictator the perspective of the Syrian people, and that was an opportunity.
Dr. Yazan, your view?
Well, I think I, again, agree with Ian and Rafif that there is now a chance for success. I was concerned that there could have been a lot of hurdles, especially seeing what happened on the first day and what happened on the first day in Montreux and the first day in Geneva when the proposed talks didn't really go ahead. But today there is a chance for success, although it's incremental. It's a small step forward. The level of representation is lower than what was expected. However, this is a positive step forward for people to sit in the same room and have the first chat together, although it was only for half an hour. This is really positive remark. Success in the larger scheme of things, as in for this conference to really produce a solution, I think this is something that's really, really wishful. But it will depend on how the dynamics play out in the next few days. It's a the Syrian crisis is very complicated, and really to discuss all the aspects of it and come out with a solution that will address all parties and will please everybody, it is almost near impossible. But the important thing is to establish a political track and see where that goes.
Ian, this is all supposed to be building on Geneva I. Remind our viewers what Geneva I was.
Well, Geneva I was the agreement that was made in June 2012. It had a lot of international support, but the Syrian parties were not there themselves. What was agreed was that the heart of any negotiation had to be the creation of what's called a transitional governing body. That's an important phrase. It doesn't say government, it says transitional government body. And I guess we might return to why that is. It said something else that's very important, which goes to the heart of why this is going to be so very difficult. That had to be agreed by mutual consent. That's the language of the Geneva I communique. So there you have the very heart of the whole thing. There has to be agreement on something that moves beyond the current Syrian situation. That's what these people are supposed to do here. Thus, all the references back to Geneva I. The goal of Geneva II is to implement what was agreed then. It hasn't been yet, but that's what's starting now.
Rafif, when you're head of your opposition, President Jarba spoke in Montreux a few days ago. He questioned whether you had a partner in this process who actually believed in Geneva I. What's your view?
Well, he was absolutely right. We have an alleged partner who refuses to accept the Geneva I communique, which of course is the framework, is the whole basis for Geneva II. It was difficult to watch Walid al-Muallim go on and actually attack the entire international community, try to engage Ban Ki-moon in a debate over the amount of time he had. So I don't know that they presented themselves with the seriousness required to show a commitment to the Geneva II process.
Yazan, what's your view? Does Geneva I mean there's no way Assad can be part of the future Syria?
Well, according to how all analysts and observers look at it, Geneva I did not mention the president, and that was why it took so much time. At that time, I remember in June 2012, it took so much time in the room to come out with a communique that all the P5 agreed on. Geneva I is a very wide process that includes, like Ian said, establishing the governing body. But there are also other sides to it. Importantly, there is maintaining the state institutions, including the army, including the security forces. That's what Geneva I talks about. Also, it talks about DDR. It talks about disarming, demobilization, and reintegration. Very important issues, very challenging, and I cannot understand how in 1 week you will actually be able to address all these aspects of such a complicated and protracted struggle. Now, the issue with Geneva I is acceptance of Geneva I communique partially. And here we're talking about everybody. The opposition, unfortunately, have come here understanding that Geneva I is about the ouster of President Assad. Now, this is not included in Geneva I, so it's the interpretation of it. Again, on the other side, the Syrian government yet attends the Geneva II, which is a conference that is announced with a name to implement Geneva I. However, we hear sometimes comments that there are concerns about certain parts of Geneva I, exactly like Ian mentioned, the transitional governing body or transitional government, because there's difference between one would be superior to the institution, one wouldn't be. One would be answerable to the constitution.
Well, let me raise that point with Rafif. Does Geneva I effectively mean there's no role for Assad?
Absolutely, and this has been our position going in. Look, we are here to represent the Syrian people, and for nearly 3 years, the Syrian people have said no more Assad. So we are here to form a transitional governing body. We are here to talk about lifting the siege. We are talking about more than 130,000 people dead, 260,000 political prisoners, a government that lost legitimacy when it fired the very first bullet on peaceful protesters.
Okay, well, you mentioned lifting the siege. One of the key goals here is to try and improve the humanitarian situation. Earlier on this week, I sat down with the UN's humanitarian chief, Valerie Amos.
We've been hearing terrible stories about people running out of food, being on the brink, literally on the brink of starvation. People being sick and injured, not being able to get healthcare in, people fearing for their lives. Remember that you are all Syrians. You could be talking about your child, your mother, your father, a member of your own family that is living through this horror. Put the people first.
So, Rafif, we heard Valerie Amos saying all of the people sitting down around the table, the U-shaped table with Dr. Brahimi, should be focusing on the people. Why don't you first forget about all the big issues, all the issues of whether Assad should be there or not, and deal with this humanitarian access? Because in one day you could save thousands of lives.
Certainly, the humanitarian crisis is among the biggest catastrophes of the modern world, and this is, of course, a priority, as are the refugees, the more than 9 million displaced or refugeed. But we have to go to the root of the problem in Syria, and that is the Assad family. Bashar al-Assad today. You know, our people are asking for freedom, and the response is Assad. We're asking for dignity, and the response is Assad. We're asking for democracy, and the response is Assad. And now we ask for transition, and the response is Assad. We are trying to build a nation, and the regime is trying to prop up one family.
Ian, we saw in Kuwait back on the 15th of January, just a week or so ago, the appeal for Syria, the amount of money the international community is supposed to provide this year, $6.5 billion. This is unsustainable, isn't it?
It is unsustainable. I think that there's a real sense widely across the international community. In Montreux the other day, there were 40 countries represented. That's, by my count, that's about a third of the whole membership of the United Nations. There is very wide international support for a political solution for the Syrian crisis, because in part of those terrible humanitarian consequences that we're seeing, because of the refugee flows, because of the general destabilization of a considerable part of the Middle East. There is a sense, I think, that internationally there has been a failure to deal with this crisis. We could debate the ins and outs of intervention or US policy or what the Russians are doing, but if you look at the picture collectively, there's been a very, very poor response. The only achievement that we've seen was the American-Russian deal over the chemical weapons, important but narrow, that's done nothing for the wider crisis. And I do think that across the world you see people saying we have to come to grips with this crisis, and that's why this is happening here today, because of that mounting alarm.
Yazan, what's your view of the international pressure? We saw 40 foreign ministers in Montreux earlier this week. Would you think behind the scenes there is pressure coming from the US on the opposition, on the Russians, from the Russians on the government, saying whatever you do, don't leave Geneva?
I would like to think so. I would like to think even this is more a pressure, and also it's an international accord and legitimacy to any forthcoming process. The fact that 40 countries convened on Wednesday in Montreux, it's a very good sign. It's just a show and demonstration of how serious the Syrian crisis is. Like Rafif said, you have now millions of people who are externally or internally displaced. I've recently been looking at one of the humanitarian reports, and there are 8 million people living below the lower poverty line. This is serious. This is serious. And the parties who are here are asked by all Syrians to really act responsibly. And you have an international community who injected strong and serious will to make the talks happen and to push the process forward. Valerie Amos, in her comments, is absolutely right. What needs to be done is to put all prejudice aside and think of the Syrian people and work towards a solution that would address all the Syrians from all backgrounds.
Rafif, what's going on behind the scenes? Are you getting calls from the Americans saying whatever you do, don't leave Geneva? If the talks break up, make sure it's the Syrian government side that caused them to collapse?
Oh, I don't think it has anything to do with the Americans. We have expressed and demonstrated our commitment to a political process. It's as Yazan has said, this is about the Syrian people. This is about restoring peace to an entire nation. This is about feeding those who are starving, returning those who have been displaced to their homes, and ultimately for the Syrian people, this is about freedom, dignity, and democracy. And so transition is the way to go, and that's our commitment.
What's your view, Ian, of the Russian and perhaps the Chinese position on all this? I spoke earlier this week to the Chinese foreign minister. I thought it was interesting that he, when I asked him about Assad and the Assad family, he said, yes, that should be on the agenda of these talks. Do you think that the Russians, and particularly the Chinese, may look very unfavourably on the Syrian government, which had been their allies, if they walk away?
I think that one of the few ways one can imagine a way out of this terrible crisis is for a change, particularly, I think, in the position of the Russians, who have been such stalwart supporters of the Syrian government since the days of Hafiz al-Assad. People speculate about it. There's a degree of wishful thinking, of course, as well. The Russians have said or hinted or signaled at various times over the last 3 years that they're not wedded to Assad as an individual. And I think that if those sort of signs were to become more visible, that would be interesting. I think a lot of people noticed on Wednesday when Walid al-Muallim was making his rather long speech in Montreux, Sergei Lavrov was gesticulating, pointing at his watch, looking very impatient. And if I was the Syrian foreign minister, I'd be quite worried by that sort of body language. And I wonder whether that might not, in future, as this process goes on, you have to see it as a dynamic thing, be translated into the kind of change by the Russians that could feed into and perhaps lead to a way out.
We were all looking at that speech, and particularly that rather testy exchange with Ban Ki-moon, because it went on too long. But there was another important thing, Yazan, in that speech, wasn't there? Mr. Muallim saying, whatever they decide here, I want it to then go back to Syria for a referendum. Is anyone going to take that seriously?
I think that's part of the Geneva communique. In a way, it is mentioned that outcomes of the transition, or whatever is agreed on, will be put to referendum.
A referendum in Syria? There's not been a free and fair election there since the Assads have been in power, 44 years.
And also, in addition, one would have to ask the serious question, how can you conduct a genuine referendum now, given the security situation in Syria? How can you access areas that are in the east and north in Syria and make sure that this is transparent? There are huge challenges. What's being said publicly may not actually reflect what will probably happen in realities behind closed doors.
Rafif, the idea of a referendum?
I mean, come on, this is a joke. Half the population is starving to death. Hundreds of people are dying every day. Who's going to go vote while there are cluster bombs being dropped, or the MiGs are flying overhead, or barrel bombs are being dropped on civilian communities? Where are people going to go?
Ian, let me ask you about the substantial discussion about the future of Syria, which they haven't got to yet. They're not even talking to each other yet. They're not talking directly to each other. They're talking through Mr. Brahimi. But the big sticking point in the end is going to be the role of Assad and the Assad family, isn't it? And they're supposed to come up with a deal by mutual consent.
That's right. I mean, it is the heart of it. It was Geneva I, as we've mentioned, was phrased in such a way as to leave that very central question aside. It was never spelled out, and clearly each side has a view, a strong view on the role of Assad or not. Every time you hear official Syrian government spokesmen, they insist that President Assad's position is not up for discussion. Every time we hear representatives of the opposition, there is that insistence that he must go, plus all the accusations of him being the source of terrorism and so on and so forth. It is a circle that I can't see being squared without some significant change, which at the moment is difficult to predict, but may yet happen. We talked about the Russians. John Kerry said the other day, at the end of the speeches in Montreux, he said, look, opening positions are opening positions, let's see what changes. I think you have to look at this as the beginning of something which, as it goes on, may bring changes with it. The opposition may get more support. Syrians watching this may decide that sitting on the fence is perhaps not the best option if there is a chance for change. The regime may escalate military action in some way. There's all sorts of variables that we have to take into account. But what I think matters is that now this thing here at the UN is underway, and I think both sides will find it difficult to walk out, then new possibilities may emerge. One can't say more than that for now, but you do have to see it as something which has the potential to create new realities.
Rafif, let's just get it clear from your position, from the opposition's position. Who from the Assad government, the current government, which ministers? Are there ministers in the current cabinet that are acceptable to you as part of a transitional government?
Absolutely. The opposition has said all along that we do not want to shut the lights off in Syria. We want to keep institutions running. What's very important to us is that nobody who has blood on his hands be part of the transitional government.
So looking at the current, they have a big cabinet in Syria. How many cabinet ministers? Have you gone through the list?
I personally have not gone through the list, but certainly this is being studied very carefully. There are plenty of government officials who would be very acceptable in a transitional government. The key now is to transition from dictatorship to democracy and to move from tyranny to freedom. And so I think with keeping the lights on, we can look at different government officials, different representatives, and see which are appropriate to retain.
Yazan, when we talk about this transitional body, I think is the word, with full executive powers, I noticed that Ban Ki-moon twice added an extra bit to that. He said, and with control over the security forces and the intelligence services. That's going to be important too, isn't it?
I think he wasn't added. It was part of Geneva I communique, if you read it. But I think what he was trying to do is at the his opening statement to stress that point. I think that just reflects to you the thoughts that were in the behind scenes in preparation for these Geneva II talks.
But you've heard Rafif there say, no one with blood on their hands. Given the brutality in Syria over almost 3 years, it's going to be very hard to find someone who's acceptable to both sides, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is difficult to find people who are accepted. At the end, you need to have people who are representatives of the Syrians. And if we're talking about all sides, you need to have people from the opposition who represent a wide range from the opposition forces and from people from their constituencies in Syria. Also, from the government side, you need to have people. You need to have people who represent Syrians who supported them along the way. Don't forget that for 3 years now, Syrians from all sides have been suffering, and what they want to see is leaderships that they trust and leaderships that they can rally behind. So the mutual consent is important, but also you need people who are actually statesmen, true leaders, people who are able to stand up and lift Syria out of this crisis. It's going to be a very, very challenging phase for any government, for anybody, whatever the name of it is agreed upon. It's very, very challenging. Syria was almost on the verge of becoming a failed state, and you need a coherent group of people to work very closely together for years, maybe, to restore Syria to the situation it was before. It's very challenging.
If this doesn't work, if these talks fail, Ian, is there a plan B?
I don't think there is. We've seen the international community struggling with the Syrian crisis almost since it began. We saw, just last August, we saw what looked like potentially a very dramatic turning point. President Obama, famous red lines, the chemical weapons attack that took place, that has been widely blamed on the Syrian government. Of course, it denies it. We've not seen a coherent response. I think that what we have here at the UN, this process, is the best that the international community will be able to come up with. I noticed that the Syrian opposition is still hoping to maybe find, the military support it hasn't really got from the West, certainly in this crisis. We know that Arab countries are supporting the armed opposition. I wonder whether, in parallel with what's happening here in Geneva, there will be an attempt to create a stronger fighting force on the rebel side with Western support. But I think the emphasis will be on diplomacy and on this political process.
Yazan, your view very quickly on that. If this fails, what will happen?
I think we'll be looking at a hibernation of diplomacy for probably years. The future will not be really very promising. Violence may escalate, and we may witness some very serious challenges to the map of Syria, to how Syria looks like now. So I really hope that these talks at least will launch a start, regardless of how long the track is. But I hope we'll see an achievement that can be built on in the future.
Well, you paint a grim alternative. Thank you very much to our guests for joining us on this edition of Inside Syria. Rafif Joejati, spokeswoman for the opposition, Dr. Yazan Abdallah, who is an academic who's here watching these talks, and Ian Black, who's the Middle East editor of The Guardian. That's it from this programme. Inside Syria will be back at the same time next week, and Al Jazeera will continue, myself and my colleague Zaina Hodder, covering every twist and turn of the process here in Geneva. Bye-bye for now.